Hi students, today we will learn about the descending tracts. The descending tracts which are ending in the spinal cord are pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. First coming to the pyramidal tract. The pyramidal tract is formed from the pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex which are in the layer 5 of the cerebral cortex. They arise from both the motor area and somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. They develop slowly and rather late. The tract reaches the level of the pyramidal decussation at about the 8th week of gestation, and the myelination is also slow. It will take up to 2 to 3 years. Due to this lengthy development, malformations can also occur after birth. First, then coming to origin, the corticospinal tract fibers, the pyramidal tract is also called as corticospinal tract. It arises from the cortex and ends in the spinal cord. So the corticospinal tract fibers originate from the following nerve cells. So the 31% will arise from the area number 4, that is primary motor cortex, and 29% arises from the premotor area, that is area number 8, and supplementary motor area, and 40% arises from the areas 3, 1, 2. Those are somatic sensory areas. So all the above fibers form the fibers of the upper motor neurons of the motor pathway. So here you can see area number 3, 1, 2, all these things. Coming to the laminae of the cerebral cortex, there are 6 laminae, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, 6A and 6B. The first layer is the molecular layer. It is composed of mostly dendrites and long axons. Then comes the external granular layer. It contains the small pyramidal cells. Then comes the pyramidal layer. Those have pyramidal cells. Then internal granular layer. These will have small cells, main site for incoming sensory information. Then comes layer 5, inner pyramidal layer. It contains large pyramidal cells and it is the main source of motor output. Then comes the multiform layer, 6A and 6B. It contains the spindle cells. You look at the pyramidal cells or bed cells which are about 70 to 100 micrometers. This is one pyramidal cell. So it is showing soma and dendrites which are in red, axon in blue. So number 1 is the soma, 2 is the basal dendrites, okay, 3 is the apical dendrites, 4 is the axon, and 5 is the collateral axon. So it has soma, basal and apical dendrites, axon and collateral axon. The largest cell is the bed cell, which is about 70 to 100 micrometers. Coming to the blood supply, each part of the pyramidal tract receives vascular supply by a different artery depending upon its anatomical position. The primary motor cortex is supplied by MCA, that is middle cerebral artery, while the anterior cerebral artery supplies the lower extremities. Middle cerebral artery is supplying face and upper extremities, whereas the anterior cerebral artery supplies the lower extremities. The corona radiata and internal capsule, which is supplied by lenticulostriate branches of the MCA. The tract continues to pass inferiorly into the brainstem, where the basilar artery provides the arterial support. So blockages to these above mentioned arteries will also manifest as weakness in the body parts which are controlled by these areas. The course and termination. So after originating in the cerebral cortex, it comes to the corona radiata and then they will pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and then downwards through the brainstem, and they will form pyramids in the medulla. Hence the name pyramidal tracts. So this is an important point because they will form pyramids in the medulla. Hence the name pyramidal tracts. Not because of they are arising from the pyramidal cells. Here this point you should remember. In the lower part of the medulla, about 90% of each pyramid decussate in the midline to reach the opposite side. So 90% of these 90% of these fibers will cross to the opposite side and 10% won't cross. So from here onwards, they will come downwards. Okay. And these fibers of corticospinal tracts are divided into two separate tracts. So here you can see motor or corticulus homunculus in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe, precentral gyrus. Here motor homunculus or cortical homunculus will be present. So here you can see this area supplies to foot, toes and genitals, and this area supplies to hip and leg, and this one to trunk, neck, head, shoulder and arm, and here elbow, forearm, wrist, hand, and here fingers, okay, and thumb, eye, nose, face, teeth, gums, jaw, tongue and pharynx. So this is the motor or cortical homunculus which is present in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So it is maintained. From there, these fibers will originate, okay, and they will enter into corona radiata. So this is the black fibers are the corona radiata, and they will enter into the internal capsule posterior limb. So we have discussed that we have two parts of corticospinal tract. One is the lateral corticospinal tract, which is constituted by 80% of fibers, 80 to 90% of fibers, which have crossed to the opposite side. Okay, and they will form the posterior part of lateral white funiculus. Okay, then they will end in the internuncial neurons of the spinal gray matter and the neurons situated in the ventral gray horn. Those are alpha motor neurons also. So they can end in the internuncial neurons or alpha motor neuron. Some fibers of the tract terminates directly on the ventral horn cells. The axons of the ventral motor neurons supply to the skeletal muscles. The neurons giving origin to the fibers of pyramidal tract along with their axons constitute the upper motor neurons. The ventral motor neurons in the spinal cord along with their axons constitute the lower motor neurons. So the whole pyramidal tract up to the innervation, that is up to the alpha motor neuron. It is the upper motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron is the lower motor neuron. Here you can see clearly. So from here the pyramidal tract is arising, then it is coming down, then it is coming up to here, then it is the pyramidal decussation. After decussating, it is forming the lateral corticospinal tract, and the whole thing is the upper motor neuron. This whole thing is the red one is the upper motor neuron. Then in the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, they will synapse with the alpha motor neuron which supply the skeletal muscles. So this alpha motor neuron is the lower motor neuron. So this is the pyramidal tracts. So here in this figure, they have shown both sensory and ascending or afferent pathways in blue color and motor and descending pathways, that is efferent pathways, in red color. So here you can concentrate on pyramidal tracts. So here these are lateral corticospinal tract. Here you can see the organization: cervical fibers, thoracic fibers, lumbar and sacral fibers are arranged like this. And this is the anterior corticospinal tract which are having uncrossed fibers. Okay, so only concentrate on these two things. Then comes the anterior corticospinal tract, which is formed by 10 to 20% of the uncrossed pyramidal fibers. These fibers descend down through the anterior white funiculus of the same side. Mostly they will end up to the mid-thoracic region. Then they will cross the midline through the anterior white commissure and they will reach the grey matter on the opposite side of the spinal cord and terminate in a similar manner to the lateral corticospinal tract. So finally what you have to understand is both fibers will cross. Lateral corticospinal tract will cross in the pyramidal decussation, anterior at the level of the mid-thoracic region in the spinal cord. So ultimately they will supply to the opposite half of the spinal cord. So here you can see what is this? Anterior corticospinal tract. So they will cross in the anterior white column, commissure, white commissure. So this is lateral corticospinal tract. Okay. So they can, the fibers will come and they will innervate the alpha motor neuron. It may be directly or through a internuncial neuron. Okay. This is the minor component of the anterior corticospinal tract, which is ipsilateral. Okay. It will also innervate the alpha motor neuron on the same side and it will cross through anterior white commissure and it will also innervate the alpha motor neuron through internuncial neuron. So the anterior corticospinal tract mostly innervates the medial muscles and lateral corticospinal tract will innervate the lateral muscles. What are the salient features of the nerve fibers of the corticospinal tracts? These tracts are unmyelinated at birth. The myelination begins in the second postnatal week and it will be completed by 2 years. And most of the fibers of these tracts, that is 80% of the fibers, are in the form of small diameter, that is having 1 to 4 micrometers, and 20% of the fibers are having large diameter, that is 11 to 22 micrometers. The large diameter fibers originates from the giant pyramidal cells or cells of Bedge, which are present in the area number 4, that is primary motor cortex. They can transmit the impulse at the rate of 70 meters per second. Certain muscles like respiratory muscles want innervation bilaterally. So, the lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts will stimulate the respiratory muscles bilaterally. The inputs of the motor cortex. What are the inputs to the motor cortex? They may be somatosensory or visual and auditory from the cortex. So the impulses, the inputs can come from the somatosensory cortex, visual and auditory cortex, or motor cortex of the opposite side, or thalamic sensory nuclei, from basal ganglia and cerebellum through thalamus, and from intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus. So they may be any input. The collaterals of corticospinal tract. So some collaterals will arise from the corticospinal tract. So where they will go? To the opposite cortex for a lateral inhibition. So why lateral inhibition is necessary? For the sharpness of the boundaries. And it may go to caudate and lentiform nuclei, red nucleus, and then they will form rubrospinal tract. From the reticular nucleus, they will form reticulospinal tract and vestibular nucleus. From there, it will form vestibulospinal tract, and the reticular nucleus and vestibular nucleus in turn applies to the cerebellum. Then to the pontine nucleus, it will form pontocerebellar tract, and to the orivally nucleus, it will form olivocerebellar tract. So the collaterals of corticospinal tract goes to all these areas. Then comes to corticobulbar pathways. These are formed by the fibers which are leaving the corticospinal tract in the brain stem and ending in the nuclei of the motor cranial nerves on the opposite side. So they are formed in the brain stem from the fibers which are leaving from the corticospinal tract, and they will end where the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves, motor cranial nerves. So in the midbrain, they will innervate 3 and 4. In the pons, 5, 6, 7 and 8. In the medulla, 9, 10, 11 and 12. So what is the function of these corticobulbar pathways? They control the voluntary movement of the muscles of the larynx, pharynx, palate, face, jaw and eyes. Next, coming to functions of the pyramidal tracts. So lateral corticospinal tract, it controls the voluntary, rapid and skillful movements of the fingers and hands of the contralateral side. Signals are coming from the primary motor cortex excites a pattern of specific muscle activity. The premotor area develops a motor image of the total muscle movement to be performed. Then it sends signals to primary motor area to excite the pattern of muscle activity. So in the premotor area, a motor image will be formed. Then this will be transmitted to the primary motor cortex. Then it forms a part of the pathway for superficial reflexes such as cremasteric, abdominal and plantar reflex. And fourth one is it can modify the sensory input. Some of the fibers of the tract end presynaptically on axon terminals of afferent neurons or dendrites or cell bodies, and thus they can affect the afferent system also. So they can modify the sensory input also. And sensory motor coordination. The somatosensory feedback to the motor cortex helps to control the precision of the muscle contraction. Next, most of these fibers end on the alpha motor neurons, but some can end on the gamma motor neurons. So, it helps to adjust the length and excitation of the extrafusal fibers and also saves the energy of brain for further stimulation of the extrafusal fibers for damping of the movement. Then, corticobulbar or corticonuclear tracts are responsible for voluntary control of muscles of the head and neck, that is larynx, pharynx, palate, jaw and eye. Then anterior corticospinal tract, supplementary motor area through anterior corticospinal tract controls bilateral postural movement. So why anterior corticospinal tract is important? The fibers will arise from the supplementary motor area and they will control bilateral postural movements. Along with the premotor area, it will provide fixation of the movements of the different segments of the body, and it helps in positional movements of the head and eyes. That is background for finer motor control of arms and hands. For example, bilateral grasping movements of the hands while climbing. So this is the importance of anterior corticospinal tracts. And these seven are the importance of lateral corticospinal tracts. So if you see applied aspects, phylogenetically anterior corticospinal tract is older. The lateral corticospinal tracts is present and well developed in the human beings and few vertebrates. And the myelination is completed after the age of 2. The cortical neurons and certain brainstem nuclei with their axons activate the lower motor neurons. Okay, up to the lower motor neuron it will call upper motor neurons. Cranial nerve nuclei, spinal motor neurons and anterior horn cells with their axons, they will activate directly skeletal muscles, that is with the help of alpha motor neuron. This alpha motor neuron is called lower motor neuron. Then comes extrapyramidal tracts. These are rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, tecto-olivospinal, MLF, medial longitudinal fasciculus. So first coming to rubrospinal tract, it will originate from the nerve cells in the red nucleus. Where is the red nucleus present? It is present in the midbrain. So these fibers will originate in the red nucleus and the axons will cross in the midbrain and they will descend as rubrospinal tract. They will come through the pons and medulla and up to the spinal cord. Okay, they will form the rubrospinal tract and they will terminate in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. Why it is important? They will facilitate the flexor muscle activity. Here you can see the lateral vestibulospinal tract which is innervating alpha motor neuron which is supplying the muscles which are involved in the anti-gravity extensors. So it is coming from the diatus nucleus. Then from the medial nucleus, medial vestibulospinal tract. So here they will innervate the muscles which are helpful for neck extension, cervical muscles. And also the collaterals form the carries the proprioception impulses to the vestibular nuclei. So these are the four vestibular nuclei. The stimulus will come from the labyrinth. And these will be carried to the oculomotor centers also. The impulses can be carried to the oculomotor centers also. So here also you can see the four vestibular nuclei. This is superior, inferior, lateral and medial. So here you have semicircular canals, arterial and macule, saccule and macule. So from the semicircular canals, you have ampullae. In the semicircular canals, the impulse will go to superior vestibular nuclei. And from there, it may go to extraocular muscles through MLF ascending fibers, medial longitudinal bundle. From the arterial and macule, it will be supplied to lateral vestibular nucleus. And from the saccule and macule, the supply goes to lateral, inferior vestibular nucleus. And medial vestibular nucleus will be supplied by semicircular canals. So from the medial, you will have descending fibers also. It is MLF descending fibers. So medial longitudinal fasciculus descending fibers and some fibers will go to the cerebellum through medial and inferior vestibular nuclei and from the medial vestibular nucleus some fibers will go to abducens nucleus, okay, where they will also send impulses to the extraocular muscles, thus forming the MLF ascending fibers. So the MLF ascending fibers will be formed by these three things. There may be ascending and descending branches. The descending branches are formed from fibers from the medial vestibular nucleus. The ascending branches will be formed from three things. That is, from the medial vestibular nucleus to the abducens nucleus, then abducens nucleus to the oculomotor nuclear complex. Then from the medial vestibular nucleus directly to the trochlear nucleus and oculomotor nuclear complex, and from the superior vestibular nucleus to the trochlear nucleus and the oculomotor nuclear complex. And this lateral vestibulospinal tract is formed from the lateral vestibular nucleus to the extensor motor neurons. And this MLF descending fibers to cervical spinal cord for adjustment of the head position. Here you can see the differences between lateral and medial vestibulospinal tract. The lateral will originate from the lateral vestibular nucleus, whereas medial will originate from the medial vestibular nucleus. Lateral will descend to all levels of the spinal cord. Medial will be descending up to cervical and upper thoracic regions. The lateral will be synapting on the interneurons which are associated with the alpha and gamma motor neurons of the antigravity and extensor muscles, which are medially situated in the spinal ventral horn. Here, the medial vestibulospinal tract neurons synapses on the interneurons of the then they are stimulating the alpha and gamma motor neurons, which are innervating the muscles of the neck and regulates the position of the head. So in this figure, you can see reticulospinal tract, that is pontine reticulospinal tract and medullary reticulospinal tract. These are stimulated from the cortex. So from the premotor and supplementary motor area, cortico-reticular tract will be arising and it will stimulate the pontine reticular formation and it will stimulate the alpha and gamma motor neuron. And from the primary motor area, after crossing, it will stimulate the medullary reticular formation. It will also stimulate the alpha and motor neurons. And these alpha and motor neurons can be directly stimulated from the corticospinal tract. This is red one. This is the muscle spindle, which is having intrafusal and extrafusal muscle fibers. So what is the difference between medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts? So the medial reticulospinal tracts, which arises from the pons, that is pontine reticular formation. So pons it descends to all levels of the spinal cord and terminates mainly on the interneurons in the spinal gray matter, and it excites medially situated alpha and gamma motor neurons which are involving in the anti-gravity muscles. So it is helpful for the extension of the lower limbs and vertebral column. Whereas the lateral reticulospinal tract, it arises from the medullary reticular formation. It also descends to the all levels of the spinal cord and it will synapse with the interneurons which are connected to alpha and gamma motor neurons, but it inhibits the anti-gravity and extensor muscles. So they will facilitate the flexor muscles. Then it is the reticulospinal tract influence on motor neuron. Nearly 2/3 of the fibers terminates at the cervical level only. The medial reticulospinal tract, okay, the medial reticulospinal tract or pontine tract, it has the excitatory influence on the extensor muscles. Whereas the lateral reticulospinal tract, it excites the flexor muscles and it probably participates in the autonomic nervous system also and controls the respiration, sweating, shivering and other autonomic motor function, automatic motor functions. Next comes the tectospinal and olivospinal tracts. Tectospinal tracts, as the name implies, it is from the superior colliculus in the midbrain and it crosses and it ends in the spinal cord. It mediates the reflex movements of the head and neck in response to visual stimuli. Then comes the olivospinal tract, origin from the inferior olivary nucleus and it descends ipsilaterally on the anterior horn cells. It is helpful for the movements arising from proprioceptors. Then comes MLF, medial longitudinal fasciculus, where it originates. It extends from the midbrain to downwards, and the fibers of this tract takes origin from different areas of the brainstem. So what are those areas? From the vestibular nuclei, from the reticular formation, from the superior colliculus, from the interstitial nucleus of Cajal, from the nucleus of posterior commissure and from the nucleus of dark spheres. So from all these areas fibers will form medial longitudinal fibers from the midbrain, and it comes downwards. So this is a diagrammatic representation. So from the vestibular apparatus and all these things, the fibers will be formed. So where it terminates? Along with the fibers of the medial vestibulospinal tract, the fibers of this tract make connection with the ventral horn cells that innervate the muscles of the neck. What are the functions of MLF? It plays important role in the pathway of ocular movements. Okay, so it ensures the harmonious movements of the eyes, head and neck in response to vestibular stimulation and auditory stimuli. It facilitates simultaneous movements of lips and tongue in speech. So here you can see anterior corticospinal tract, lateral corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, MLF, okay, pontine reticulospinal tract, medullary reticulospinal tract. So these are the locations of these tracts. So it is a tabular form. You can see pyramidal tracts, extra pyramidal tracts. Pyramidal tracts, lateral and anterior. Okay. So origin, first you have to say from where they are arising and the pathway and their termination. Okay. So from where they are arising? From the area number 4, primary motor cortex, and area number 6, premotor cortex of the opposite cerebral hemisphere, and primary motor cortex, premotor cortex of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. So lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. So lateral is crossed one, anterior is uncrossed one. It will control the skilled movements, especially of the hands. They are present in the lateral white column of the spinal cord, and anterior is present in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. There is extrapyramidal tracts, rubrospinal from the red nucleus in the midbrain, okay, to the spinal cord. So it will helpful in the unconscious coordination of movements, that is controls muscle tone and synergy. Vestibulospinal tract, it is present in the anterior white column from the vestibular nucleus to the spinal cord, unconscious maintenance of posture and balance. Then comes the reticulospinal tracts, medial and lateral. So they are present in the anterior and lateral white column from the reticular formation of the medulla and pons. So medial will form from the medulla, lateral from the pons and midbrain up to the spinal cord. So mainly the medial one is responsible for inhibitory influence on the motor neurons to the skeletal muscles. Lateral one mainly responsible for facilitatory movements in the extensor muscles. Tectospinal from the superior colliculus up to the spinal cord. It controls the movement of head and neck arm in response to visual stimuli. Next comes descending tracts which are ending in the brain stem. Corticonuclear or corticobulbar and corticopontocerebellar tracts. So corticonuclear or corticobulbar tracts, it may be medial or lateral one. So medial one, these will originate from the area number 8, that is motor eye field. Then they will descend through the corona radiata and internal capsule. Then they will end in the motor nerve nuclei, cranial nerve nuclei, which moves the eyes, that is 3, 4 and 6. So corticonuclear corticobulbar tracts. And then comes the lateral corticobulbar tract. These will origin from the lower one-third of the motor area 4. They descend through the corona radiata and the internal capsule, and then they will end in the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, 10, 11 and 12. Then comes the corticopontocerebellar. So cortico from the cortex to the cortex to the pons and pons to the cerebellum. Through this pathway, the cerebellum comes under functional control of the cerebral cortex for coordination of the movements. Okay, so from the cortex to the pons to the cerebellum. So it helps to coordinate the movements. The next video will be on lesions of the spinal cord.